Hello, viewers. This is Kamachima with my talk show Perspectives. And we have here a very distinguished topic and the guest. We have here Mr. Ankit Panda, who is an award-winning writer and international security expert. He's an adjunct senior fellow in the Defense Posture Project at the Federation of the American Scientists, and he's also a senior editor at The Diplomat. And we have with us Mr. Ali Zia Jafri. He's an associate editor of the Pakistan Political and Research Associate at the Center for Security Strategy and the Policy Research at the University of Lahore. Thank you very much, both of you gentlemen. And viewers, we are here to talk about and congratulate Mr. Ankit Panda, who is an American author, definitely, on his new book, Kim Jong-un and the Bomb, Survival and Deterrence in North Korea. So first of all, Ankit, congratulations for your book. And I saw on your Twitter that you just got the copy just today.
That's right. Yeah, I was a surprise. I didn't know they were coming in the mail, but it was a nice surprise to see, especially given the pandemic and the shipping situation worldwide.
So even then, congratulations. Definitely the people would love to read it physically, where you can send those, and definitely if it will be available online, they can purchase that. But this is a big mileage for you. Since we have been talking that the North Korea, which is considered as a rogue nuclear state, and they have conducted five successful nuclear tests in 2006, 2009, 2013, and in 2016. So there was a perspective that the nuclear non-proliferation regime was compromised, and it was not something good which the global institutions which are working for the curtailing or the controlling of the nuclear proliferation. So definitely, I think Mr. Ankit Panda will be the best person who can tell us that how this small, poor nation was able enough to get this nuclear bomb, and what is the story. So I think we should go directly to Mr. Ankit Panda. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, so, I'll start by addressing a bit about the challenge to the non-proliferation regime. North Korea is unique among nuclear weapons possessors for being the only country to have once signed and participated in the non-proliferation treaty regime, to have then left that treaty and successfully built nuclear weapons. That's unprecedented. No other country has done that. India, Pakistan, Israel were not part of the NPT, never assented to the treaty, even though their possession of nuclear weapons is a concern for the non-proliferation regime more broadly. But North Korea presents that particular challenge. And of course, if you want to understand the story of how they got to where they are, really it's a story that spans decades. We can go all the way back to 1952 and the founding of the Atomic Research Institute in North Korea. We could go even further into the Cold War to look at efforts in South Korea to develop nuclear weapons and the potential planning that the North Korean leadership had to do with the future. But really what we see, I think, is the story of nuclear North Korea beginning somewhere around in the early 1990s, a few years after they have their first research reactor operational at Yongbyon, the 5 megawatt gas graphite reactor they operated there. A few years prior, they had a Soviet-designed IRT-2000 reactor in the country, which relied on highly enriched uranium sourced from the Soviet Union, which was obviously a constraint on what they could do. And that was something that they used primarily to experiment with things like separating plutonium and a few other issues that would eventually help them design a nuclear weapon decades later. So the story, I mean, when it comes to national strategy, though, I think what's interesting to take away from the North Korean story is the story of a determined proliferator. It's not to say that the North Koreans didn't have obstacles in their way and the world didn't try to stop them. The United States almost went to war several times to stop the North Koreans. There were several attempts at diplomacy, but really what we end up with today is a country that openly possesses nuclear weapons and will likely be normalized in that status, simply because the world won't be able to do enough to rapidly cap, reduce, and eliminate North Korea's nuclear weapons, right? That's the policy framework that a lot of us call for, but it's going to be very difficult to implement.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So, Mr. Syed Ali Zia Jafri, how would you see that this wonderful book by Ankit is going to be helpful for the academicians, for researchers, for students to understand this nuclear non-proliferation and the specific case of North Korea?
I think, thank you very much for having me here. And I think anyone who watches events in North Korea, especially about the nuclear angle and about the nuclear rivalry between North Korea and the US, they definitely come across Ankit's work. He's written in War on the Rocks, he's written for a diplomat, he's written for many other places. I would be very uncomfortable talking about a book that I haven't read as yet. I would be very intellectually honest with you in this case. I think any book in on any subject written academically, written with research, is useful, regardless of the fact you agree or disagree with it. So there are no two ways about the usability and the utility of a particular book for an academic. If I have to work on North Korea, or if I have to work on deterrence, I think if you go back in time, if you read The Meaning of the Nuclear Revolution by Robert Jervis, I think not the case of North Korea and the US perfectly fits on his theory of nuclear revolution. And one can go on and talk about this, but I think I would be definitely uh, more comfortable talking about this when I read the book. This is my
Well,
answer
well,
upfront, and
okay.
I really look forward to reading the book as soon
Well,
as possible.
okay. Thank you very much. But my perspective was that how it can help the researcher and academicians and the students to understand the perspective. But anyhow, coming back to Mr. Ankit, Mr. Ankit, how would you see that the efforts? Have you written something about the efforts by the President Trump for getting closer to the Kim Jong Un and the regime? That how much they have been helpful, or how much they have been closer to getting to the Mr. Kim agree on denuclearization?
Yeah, so no, thanks for that question. So the second part of the book is really heavily focused on the Trump-Kim diplomacy and the contemporary efforts, or the contemporary policy debate, actually, about North Korea, because there is a very rich policy debate in the United States about what the next step should be. It's very much apparent that status quo U.S. policy, which has been to seek North Korea's rapid denuclearization in a complete, verifiable, and irreversible way, or sorry, dismantlement of North Korea's weapons of mass destruction, not denuclearization, that policy has been largely unsuccessful. What I will say about the Trump administration's approach, it did one thing, which was that it succeeded in reducing bilateral tensions between the United States and North Korea, which had grown quite great by the end of 2017 and early 2018. So when the summit was announced, or the notion of a summit was announced in principle that Trump would meet Kim in March 2018, immediately we saw a decline in tensions between the two sides. That, however, of course, has limited analytical value, I think, because if we analyze the source of those tensions in the first place, I think there's a good case to be made that a lot of the saber rattling was coming straight from the White House. So the chapter in the book that describes this bout of diplomacy is actually called The Arsonist and the Firefighter, because both of those were the same person, in my view, Donald Trump, who initially is willing to, totally destroy North Korea, as he memorably says in September 2017 at the United Nations General Assembly General Debate. And he moves from that to later falling in love with Kim Jong Un. So we have a remarkable interpersonal relationship between the two leaders, unprecedented in history. The Singapore summit in June 2018 is the first meeting between a sitting North Korean head of government and an American head of state. That said, the accomplishments when it comes to non-proliferation and disarmament with North Korea are effectively nil. Well, that's maybe a little unfair. We did have a moratorium on long-range missile testing and nuclear testing. As of December 2019, Kim Jong-un has told the world that that moratorium no longer remains in place, but it was announced in April 2018, and one could make a case that that was announced to facilitate diplomacy with the United States. I think that's fair. And the moratorium does have value. It is good for the world. It is good for the United States that the North Koreans have not tested any intercontinental range ballistic missiles or nuclear devices since 2017. Their last ICBM test was in November 2017, and their last nuclear test was in September 2017. So that we've seen neither of those kinds of tests is positive. It gives them less data to improve their designs, to iterate and move forward potentially to more sophisticated types of missiles. But we need to ask ourselves what the last 3 or so years of silence have meant for the North Koreans. And I think quietly behind the scenes, there has been a lot of qualitative advancement being done, and I suspect that soon enough, I hope not too soon, not before the book comes out, so the book can be a little bit current at least. But I'm expecting that soon enough we will begin to see what the North Koreans have been working on for the last 3 years. And that's really the problem here. It's that they have been qualitatively and quantitatively expanding their nuclear forces, right? In 2017, Kim Jong-un declared that his nuclear force was complete, but that of course wasn't true because no country is going to declare its nuclear force complete after testing an intercontinental range ballistic missile design once. They tested two separate designs 3 times total. It's a fairly limited testing record. But the main thing is they need to operationalize nuclear command and control. They need to build out a nuclear force in quantitative terms, think about deployment. And actually recently in May, just a few weeks ago, had a very interesting meeting at the highest levels of the Workers' Party of Korea, very much on this topic of nuclear organization. And the book also talks about that, talks about what we can glean about how the North Koreans are thinking about command and control and physically organizing the nuclear enterprise in their country.
Well, thank you, Ankit. Coming to you, Ali, how would you see that if the North Koreans getting nuclear weapons and they're detonating the devices whenever they want? At one hand, they have damaged the nuclear non-proliferation regime, and on the other hand, here is India, which is getting an access to the export control regimes. How much it is going to damage the efforts of nuclear non-proliferation?
Okay, I will answer this in two parts. I think first of all, they exercise their right of getting out of the NPT, and then did all that they have doing since then. I think there are concerns, but then eventually, when states look after the security maximization model that Scott Sagan talked about, there is nothing in the non-proliferation regime that can stop states from doing so. That is that. And the other thing is, why would Ankit talked about the fact that the leader of the reclusive North Korean regime was, rubbing shoulders with the biggest with the head of the state of the biggest country in the world. So that the equalizer that the nuclear weapon brought about in that relationship, an elephant meeting with a rogue state, that is something huge. The other thing is that why would North Korea allow the US to carry out a counterforce strike when it can gradually shift towards having the ability to carry out a counter value strike on the US? So the US, why would North Korea not obtain the deterrence value of the nuclear weapon when it's clearly available? Uh, we know, and Ankit has also written about it many times, that North Korea does not have the full capability of reaching the US homeland, but still it has engendered a lot of deterrence to keep the Americans away from carrying out a decapitating first strike on the North Korean nuclear weapons. So this is what the fact that North Korea declared its nuclear program complete, whether it was complete or not, that's besides the point. That actually compelled Trump in a way to change the status of him from Rocket Man in September 2017 to my best buddy in Singapore. So if you compare that with Iran, that is not happening. So I'm afraid that
Okay.
Iran can get a cue that look, the nuclear weapon has given something to Kim that is not available to us. So this
Okay.
is my prime concern about the future of proliferation and the regime as well. Iran
Okay.
might fancy these ideas.
Okay, thank you. Ankit, coming back to you, how do you see that this book is going to help to the American viewers and to the viewers in Asia Pacific, and particularly how they will look at this scholarship, how it is going to help even the decision makers to take decision on North Korea?
Sure. I mean, so the book has a clear thesis to it that I think is an important one for especially policymakers to recognize in the United States, which is that we are not going to be living in a world with a disarmed North Korea in the short term. And I think premising our policies around this idea that we can rid this country of nuclear weapons by sheer will of force or through sanctions or even through military force is a dangerous idea. It's a non-starter. And what that means is that we need to start thinking about realistically how we can think about North Korea as a risk reduction problem. I don't want to say an arms control problem because that means different things to different people, especially, in a superpower like the United States, use the word arms control. The only country that comes into the minds of some people is Russia. That arms control is only for Russia. It's not for it's not even for China. It's not even for lesser nuclear powers, certainly like North Korea. So maybe not arms control, but a practical, pragmatic risk reduction approach is necessary. Of course, much of the book is also descriptive, talks about what exactly the North Koreans have and what they did, the level of sophistication. One of the problems I've noticed in the U.S. with less. So first of all, I should also clarify that the book is not strictly a scholarly book. It's a trade book designed for general audiences. So for anybody really interested in the North Korean question, policymakers, academics, I think equally will find it useful. But the case I've also tried to make is that the North Koreans, they often get laughed at for their capabilities. That this is a basket case of a country. There's you can look at films like The Interview making fun of Kim Jong-un. After North Korea conducted an H-bomb test, or claimed to have conducted an H-bomb test in January 2016. The New Yorker ran a magazine cover with Kim Jong-un portrayed as a baby, playing with missiles. So there's this idea that this isn't a serious place, this isn't a serious concern, that these are, just toy missiles that Kim Jong-un is playing with. It's not a serious deterrent. It's all ramshackle. I think that's very much, again, dangerous, because if that's what you truly believe, you're going to be a little bit more interested and like our colleague said, potentially carrying out a counter-force strike on North Korea, right? So it's important to take their capabilities seriously as well. But at the same time, it's important to also recognize that there are limitations, that this is still a growing nuclear program. So my hope is that the book makes all of these points and eventually begins to play a role in shifting the needle on the American policy debate. If I could talk a little bit about American politics, we're in an election year here, and one of the things that was reassuring for me to see last year and this year was if you look at the Democratic side of the foreign policy debate, you're starting to see a little bit more of a realization of how the North Korea problem has changed. I think the reality of what it means to be in a third nuclear deterrence relationship is beginning to sink in for a lot of Americans. The United States has only practiced deterrence with two nuclear armed states, Russia and China. And the last time the United States had to synthesize, American policymakers had to really synthesize and conceive of what it would mean to be in a nuclear deterrence relationship with a new country was really the early 1970s, right? 1971 was the first time when China successfully tested the DF-5 ICBM, which put the United States homeland under the range of China's nuclear weapons. And at that time, that was really, of course, that coincided with the U.S. Chinese rapprochement under Richard Nixon. But since then, the United States hasn't had to think about this problem. It's a very foreign problem, especially for a generation of policymakers on nuclear policy who think about deterrence as being something quite different. So there are also a lot of questions that I offer answers to in the book about how do we even begin to think about deterrence in such an asymmetric context where you have a country whose GDP, we don't have precise estimates for North Korean GDP, but most estimates would put it at around the level of what the United States spends on 2 aircraft carriers. So how do you practice nuclear deterrence when you're a nuclear superpower against a country with a GDP with the value of 2 of your aircraft carriers that can still carry out counter value strikes on New York City and Washington D.C. So it's an interesting problem, but I think it's one that's very serious to understand, especially if we're to make successful, productive policy decisions on North Korea going forward.
Okay, Ankit, before going to Ali, I would just want to ask one more question that what have you mentioned that how the Japanese and the South Koreans think and what have you written about their perspective and idea that what is their regional view of the nuclearization of North Korea?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the book is very much also written for audiences in Japan and South Korea. I'm hoping to have translations available as soon as possible. The South Koreans and the Japanese, of course, had long been in the front line. Americans sort of woke up in 2017 and began to think about a nuclear North Korea more seriously when the North Koreans demonstrated an ICBM capability. But for the South Koreans, it's been considerably longer. Really going back to the first nuclear test, I think that was when the concept of the North Koreans having a nuclear physics package on a ballistic missile began to become a lot more realistic, even though there were questions about miniaturization and the extent to which they were actually able to create a missile-mateable warhead, which was, again, around 2016, 2017, we think. But the policy response to these countries is obviously very important. So first of all, I think one of the things that comes up in a lot of these conversations these days, particularly under the current environment for American extended deterrence in East Asia under the Trump administration, is what will North Korea's progress mean for potential proliferation in Northeast Asia? Of course, South Korea and Japan are both NPT member states in good standing, non-nuclear weapon states. They've committed and forsworn the acquisition of nuclear weapons in perpetuity. But of course, as we just heard again, the NPT does allow a country to exercise withdrawal if its supreme national interests are threatened. And if Japan or South Korea begin to feel that American extended deterrence is no longer sufficiently robust, of course, that has, I think, dire consequences for the future of the non-proliferation regime. American extended deterrence is not an endeavor of altruism. America does not extend its nuclear umbrella for simply liking other countries. We do it for self-interested reasons, which is that it is a part of the American non-proliferation toolkit. By providing nuclear assurance to these countries, they will have less incentive to think about their own nuclear weapons program. The debate in Japan and South Korea is also very different for obvious reasons. Japan, having been the only country to have suffered a nuclear attack in wartime, has certain political sensitivities associated with this. But Japanese national security elites have talked about nuclear weapons for decades in very hushed tones. It's not a very public debate in Japan, but it is a conversation that happens. South Korea, of course, had a nuclear weapons program that was abandoned in the 1970s, and lives on the doorstep of North Korea. And actually, when I go to South Korea, there is a lot of interest in nuclear deterrence in South Asia, because of course the North Koreans have a little bit of a similar dilemma as the Pakistanis, which is how do you deter a conventionally superior neighbor, and what is the value of nuclear weapons in doing that? So there is interest, of course. In South Asia, you have nuclear weapons on both sides of the equation, but the qualitative superiority that the South Koreans perceive themselves to have is, again, something that weighs on the minds of the North Koreans. The North Koreans will effectively treat assets, including F-35A fighters, like a country like Pakistan might treat nuclear weapons, for example. The kind of gestures that they conducted last year after South Korea showed off its new stealth fighters was, I think, quite instructive in that regard. But going back to South Korea, there is, of course, a major part of the story to be told when it comes to the contemporary round of diplomacy and the role of the South Korean government there. And I try to do justice to that in the book. I mean, of course, I'm writing the book as an American author, and it is very much written for, I think, an American audience. So the book emphasizes the U.S.-North Korea relationship more than it does the other aspects. But a South Korean President, Moon Jae-in, certainly had an instrumental role in fostering the diplomacy that did take place in 2018 and 2019. There is, of course, the tragedy that's just a coincidence that South Korea, the United States, and North Korea are never really all three on the same page. Just as a matter of political coincidence, there have been very few years in the past 2.5 decades where the United States and South Korea have really had governments that share the same political affinity. Usually, if you had a liberal in the United States, you've had a conservative in South Korea, or you've had a conservative in South Korea and a liberal in the United States, and usually that's meant that the policy approach on North Korea hasn't really synced up. And I think with Moon Jae-in and Donald Trump, we see that manifest in a particularly acute way, which is that Moon Jae-in is willing to do anything he can for the sake of peace with North Korea. And Donald Trump is fine to talk to Kim Jong-un, but of course the US national policy infrastructure isn't willing to move heaven and earth to, for example, relax sanctions on North Korea. So that's, again, a big part of the story here and why we haven't really made any progress.
Okay, now coming to Ali. Ali, how do you see that on one hand, the Americans are getting into North Korea and they're asking that we should go for denuclearization, and they're having the support of the Japanese, South Koreans, and to some extent the Chinese. But on the other hand, when it comes to South Asia, the leverage of the American power, or as a third party, they cannot even talk on the bilateral dispute like Kashmir, forget the nuclear weapons, or the way the India is being given the preferential treatment as far as the nuclear non-proliferation is concerned.
I think one can talk in detail about how great powers actually, differentiate between um, various countries when it comes to nuclear weapons. You have literature has come out about how the U.S. has been non-committal in its non-proliferation policy when it is faced with foreign policy interests. Like Dr. Rabia wrote a book, The Blind Eye, which talks about how the US turned a blind eye towards Pakistan's nuclear weapons program while it wanted to eke out its own interests in the Afghan war. So, this is on record. You can't expect states to have the same policy across region. There are interests. Ankit talks about the fact that there's no altruism when it comes to providing extended deterrence. Let me go a step further. We into 2017 we heard a lot about the word decoupling. Let's suppose the US is faced with the choice of either saving Tokyo or New York. What will it choose? Of course, New York is more valuable to the US as compared to Tokyo or Seoul for that matter. So I think this is tragedy of great power politics. If I want to invoke a very famous title of a very famous book, so I think I won't read too much into it. South Asia is a different ball game. North the Korean Peninsula is a different ball game. I know in South Asia we are now uh, coming up. The US is now coming up with the Indo-Pacific strategy. It was revealed in 2019. We have the Quad, we have other things, and now I think the pandemic will further intensify the US-China rivalry, and of course South Asia and the Indo-Pacific theater, including the Indian Ocean region, would be a major theater of conflict between the US and China. I think obviously non-proliferation or arms control in South Asia is way down the priority ladder of the US in that region. The only thing that the US worries about near that region is Iran. That's a different discussion, and we can go
Okay.
into details if you
Okay.
want.
Ankit, just concluding this session in just a couple of questions, I just want to ask you that how do you see the strategic stability in South Asia, and especially that although both nuclear and India and Pakistan, they have the nuclear weapons, they have never been, they have never been part of the NPT. So how do you see that? Do the countries have achieved the strategic stability, or there is more to come, or for having this more reputation? The way the India is trying to be the member of the nuclear supply groups, or this the strategic stability will not be it will not be achieved. How do you see this, please?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I do a lot of work on South Asia as well, and I mean, one of the theses that I think I've come to appreciate for South Asia is that India and Pakistan are perhaps where the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves a couple decades into nuclear coexistence. That we have had 22 years now of nuclear learning between the two powers about what it means to coexist in South Asia as nuclear weapons possessors. Right, we can go back to the Lahore Agreement. We can go back to Kargil and talk about what nuclear weapons meant then and what they mean now in South Asia, and I think have very different things to say. Of course, part of that story is simply the advance of capabilities in the two countries, but also we have the change in national politics in both countries, especially in India, that I think has had important consequences on the national defense strategy of both countries. Strategic stability, if we define strategic stability as the notion that both countries affect, there's a very simple definition, is both countries accept vulnerability to the other's nuclear weapons. Does that obtain in South Asia today? I would say no, and that's not surprising. That's simply, I think, most nuclear weapon states have shown themselves to behave in that way, right? And they have sought a way out of vulnerability. Pakistan is investing in things like submarine-launched cruise missiles with the Babur 3 and the Ababil MIRV-capable medium-range ballistic missile to improve the survivability of its forces and to improve the flexibility of its forces. In the meantime, India is making investments of its own in ballistic missile defense, anti-satellite capabilities, whatever you want to call it. I actually think that ASAT test had quite a bit to do with ballistic missile defense. So we are seeing, I think, something that is moving South Asia further away from true strategic stability between the two countries. The Balakot crisis last year, I think, can be quite instructive again in thinking about nuclear escalation in South Asia. Of course, nuclear weapons were not salient to the Balakot crisis per se, but it obviously gave us a lot of important data on how the two sides might think about escalation. And just looking at the public response to Balakot in both countries, obviously India and Pakistan have a vibrant national debate, let's say, on national security matters. And looking at what both countries took away from Balakot, I think was a dangerous lesson, which is that escalation is manageable, it's easy, it's clean. All said and done, Balakot didn't seem quite clean when we were living through it. But after the fact, you've had a lot of commentary in India and Pakistan about what the Pakistan Air Force did, what the Indian Air Force did, and how it suited national interests perfectly and really managed escalation really well, even though an Indian pilot was shot down and captured and everything. But that's really, I think, again, we got very lucky, I think, with Balakot. Especially with the fact that you had this clear resolution with the release of the Indian pilot back into the hands of India, which was a clear de-escalatory step. And what if we hadn't had that? What if we'd had a clear fatality, for example, in that shoot down? So there are serious questions that I think give me concern. If I look at the capabilities that are being developed on both sides, again, I see this very similar signs to the Cold War, that the two sides are unwilling to fully accept vulnerability to the other's nuclear forces. And of course, with India in particular, there is of course the China factor to talk about, which is that India's doctrine of credible minimum deterrence might exist against Pakistan, but it does not yet exist against China, and that I think has serious implications for how I think Indians are thinking about the kind of nuclear force that they need to have in the years to come.
Well, Ankit, just one last quick question to you, and that is about the escalation ladder. How do you see this escalation ladder between India and Pakistan? And do you see that there are chances of any kind of a limited conflict under the nuclear overhang? Because we have been seeing that India is blaming for the launch pads, and time and again, things have not been very good, and especially this right-wing Hindu nationalist government is in office.
Yeah, the escalation ladder in South Asia, there's a lot of, I know there's a lot of good work being done on this, and there's lots of Pakistani scholars and Indian scholars that have their own models for how they think a nuclear conflict will begin and end in South Asia. And honestly, if you'd interviewed many of these scholars and you'd interviewed many of the folks working on military issues or national defense strategies in South Asia, and you'd ask them about, I actually remember this because I was asked by a few people pre-Balakot to give kind of my impression of what I thought the Indian Army would do or the Indian Armed Forces would do after the Pulwama attack. And I don't think any single person predicted that we would see a limited Indian Air Force incursion striking, mainland Pakistan. Which is to say that I think there are, the national leaderships in both countries, I think, are thinking a little bit outside the box. The Indians have obviously been giving a lot of thought to how they can sort of escape the problem that has kept them boxed in now since Pakistan moved to full spectrum deterrence and basically created the impression that any Indian use of conventional armed force would result in potentially, as Tom Schelling said, falling off that cliff and successfully practicing brinksmanship in South Asia. The escalation ladder in South Asia, I think, is less clear than many of us think it is. That it's difficult to predict. I don't want to say. If you'd ask me in isolation, an Indian Air Force strike on mainland Pakistan, how does Pakistan respond to that? I think there are a fair bit of people that might have said, okay, look, at that point, I think we start to see some Nasser batteries potentially, potentially come into play, or potentially Pakistan is thinking about introducing nuclear weapons. We didn't see that, as far as we know, in the public record. On the Indian side, we have reports that Arihant was deployed during the Balakot crisis, which again, if true, that I think is quite surprising. That India would choose to deploy its SSBN. There are a lot of questions about how India is precisely going to incorporate its ballistic missile submarine into its plans to manage escalation, let's say. So, I have my own set of questions and try to be humble in my own understanding of the escalation ladder in South Asia. Not to say that I don't have concerns, but yeah, that's what I'll say for now.
Yes, I think the
But I just
discussion. Yes, yes,
but I
you
just
please.
have a
I was just
yes.
coming to you, but you
I,
have a point to say.
yes, yes. I think talking about the escalation ladder, the genesis of the term, we go back to Khan and we talk about his famous book. I think South Asia cannot afford 44 rungs in the ladder. It could be way less. I agree with Ankit. It's very unclear. Although there are dangers, but those very dangers resulting from a balance of resolve may actually be good for deterrence as well. So there are two sides to it, and both one can argue for both sides compellingly, and this is why the ladder is very unclear. We
Hmm.
don't know what could happen, and the elements that are now coming in now. The Indian leadership is brazenly talking about capturing Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. This is a nuclear armed state trying to obtain a military victory under a nuclear overhang. It is something quite antithetical to concept of nuclear revolution and all, and the overall dynamics that nuclear weapons bring about. So I think this is a concern that we need to highlight as scholars and as even as practitioners, that the new elements coming into the fore are important points of discussion as we go forward in our understanding and scholarship on the South Asian nuclear dynamics.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Ankit Panda and Mr. Alizia. It was wonderful to be with you people. And I think this book will help definitely to the students and those who are interested to understand the Kim Jong-un and his policies then and how that area could be the future nuclear conflict. Hope that won't happen. But thank you very much, both of you gentlemen. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Thank you.